3.4 is on this really long statement, and it's called the corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Corresponding parts of a congruent triangles are congruent has a meaning, and it's really perfect in 3.4 because what we learned in 3.2 is, let me just kind of give you an idea. If I have a triangle that looks like this and this, and you have another triangle that looks like this and this, in 3.2 we learned that I have to have a minimum amount of information. That this angle here and this angle here, if you just know that, you don't have enough information to know that the two triangles are congruent to each other. You had to have more than that. But if you had, let's say, that and that and that, still not enough. That's an angle and a side, that's an angle and a side. Not enough information to know these are congruent to each other. But then we learned that if we get one more piece of information, that we could say that these two triangles are congruent by something called angle side angle. We had 5 shortcuts. Well, in this section, we're no longer talking about the two triangles being the same as each other. Let me look at this. Let's call this A, B, C, and then I'll go D, E, F, just like that, so it'll be in order. In section 2, we learned that we could prove this is the same as that. In section 4, what we're going to say is, if I know that the two triangles are congruent, then all their parts and all their angles are congruent. For example, right now, you know the angle B is the same as angle E. You know the angle C is the same as angle F. But as soon as you know that these two triangles are congruent, you now know that their parts are also the same. Angle A has to be the same as angle D because of corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Or side AC has to match up with side DF because the corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Translation: the matching parts, when you've proved two triangles are congruent, they're also going to be congruent. That's what that means. And instead of writing out this whole big long statement, what you can write are these 5 letters. Cpctc. If you write Cpctc, you're telling me you know that the matching parts are also going to be congruent after you've proven two triangles are congruent. I think the hardest part for most of you is, what does Cpctc stand for? The corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. I'm going to say that again. The corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. What does Cpctc stand for? The corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. That's it. I have to say it multiple times so it starts sticking in your head. It's the reason why you learned the 5 shortcuts, like side, 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 and side, and angle, side, angle. Because once you prove the triangles are congruent, now you can say all their parts are congruent by Cpctc. And so there's going to be a shift in the proofs in section 4. The shift in proofs is, instead of trying to prove that the two triangles are congruent, you're going to now prove that an angle is the same as the other angle. And that's what we're going to be doing. So, that brings me to this last thing. If you are proving congruent parts, your last reason is going to be CP. What does that say? Cpctc. There we go. Would you pass those out since I'm still recording? Just give an equal stack to each one in the column, please. Since I did not give you guys the worksheet is being passed out to you as we speak. You are going to get worksheet 4. I am going to show you number 1, number 3, and number 6. Okie dokie. I'm going to give you one last tidbit of information before we start. If you don't have one, just hang on a little bit. I'll find you one in a second, okay? The last tidbit is this. Most of the strategy we're going to use will be something like the same stuff we've been doing on the letter worksheets, 3A, 3B, 3C, 3D, 3E. You were doing that to prove two triangles are congruent. Now what you're going to do is the same strategy as 3A through 3E, except you're going to add an additional step at the end using Cpctc to prove that the angles are congruent. I don't know if I said the right letters that time, but okay. Here we go. Number 1. Let's do this one together. Number 1, I'm hoping it matches with what you have on your worksheet. What I would do if I were you is I would write your first statement as we have been. Same strategy. Your first statement should always be with whatever is given. So we're going to write everything after the word given. I'm going to write angle, SPT, is congruent to angle, OPT. The other thing that is given is segment SP is congruent to segment OP. And my reason is given. I'll have to get you one in a second. Sorry. And so, after we have our angle is congruent to the angle and the SP is congruent to LP, we should go to our picture to see that this has been added. SP is congruent to OP. Yes, it is. It's already marked for us. This angle has a single arc, which is the same as this angle, which has a single arc, because it's given. It says we need to prove that these two angles are congruent. Your strategy, we need to prove that the two triangles are congruent first. We have a side and an angle. We have a side and an angle. We're going to have to use some property that we learned in A, B, C, D, or E, and these ones. I bet you see a side that is shared. Something that is the same in both triangles. Which two letters are the same in both triangles? Do you know? If you know, say it out loud. I heard several of you know. TP is congruent to TP. It's the same in both triangles. It's a shared side. Since this is our second congruent side, I'm going to put 2 congruent marks on that picture. And my next question is, why do I know that this is the same in both triangles? There's a property that we did on worksheet 3A. Do you remember what the name of that property is? If you know it, say it out loud. Ooh, good. A lot of you knew that one. Reflexive property of congruence. Now at this point, you have a side touching an angle, touching a side in the one triangle, and you have a side touching an angle, touching a side in the other triangle. Because you have an SAS and an SAS in both, and that matches, we now can prove that the two triangles are congruent. And it doesn't matter which ones you prove. Let's use STP because that reminds me of Stone Temple Pilots, which is an old band from the old days, back when I was in high school. STP is congruent to triangle OTP. How do I know that these two triangles are congruent to each other? Because I have a shortcut. The shortcut is side angle side. And the last thing, what are we trying to prove? We're trying to prove that angle S is the same as angle O. Angle S is congruent to angle O. If this triangle is congruent to that triangle, then all the matching parts have to be congruent. We just wrote that down. There's an abbreviation. The hardest part is remembering the 5 letters. The Cpctc. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. That's how it works. It's our last reason. Because these parts are the same after we've proven the triangle. That's how it works. Okay? I have a couple more examples. I chose number 3 for you because 3 said, copy and mark the figure to show the given information. Explain how you'd prove angle P is congruent to angle Q. It gives you that PK is congruent to QK. It gives you that KL bisects angle PKQ. Here's PKQ. This angle gets bisected. I hope you know what the word bisect means. It means cuts into 2 equal pieces. So I'm going to actually draw that this gets cut into 2 equal pieces right there. Let me make that a little bit bigger. So how am I going to prove that this angle is congruent to that angle? I'm probably going to have to say that angle, I'm going to start off by saying that angle PKL is congruent to Q, angle QKL, by the definition of an angle bisector. Then what I would probably do is I would do KL is congruent to KL by the reflexive property of congruence. And I'm not being so formal. If you want to be formal and do a 2-column proof here, you can. This is going to be the basics of it because it didn't say make a 2-column proof. So I'm just being a little less formal. I'm explaining it by saying, oh, this because of that, and this because of that. And then the triangles are going to be congruent. Once I prove that, which postulate is going to prove that this triangle is congruent to that triangle? Do you remember? Or what do I have? One of the shortcuts. If you know the 3 letters, say it out loud. Ooh, we don't know. I have a side touching an angle, touching a side. That's the same as a side touching an angle, touching a side. The 2 triangles are going to be congruent by side, angle, side. And then I would use Cpctc. So that's a little less than formal, but it has every bit of information you need to prove it. The last example that I have for you is number 6. Number 6 has B is the midpoint of AC and AD is congruent to CD. Prove that those two angles are congruent to each other. So we start off with our first statement. B is the midpoint of AC. And then AD is congruent to CD. My first reason is given. And then what I do is I go to my picture and make sure that AD is marked and CD is marked. They're congruent. B is a midpoint of AC. I need to go and make sure I know this is a midpoint. I circle it. I usually write the word midpoint next to B since it's a midpoint. And I probably can do something with that. I probably can use the definition of a midpoint, if that was given to me, to prove that a couple things are congruent to each other. If that's the midpoint, then two pieces have to be the same. Which two pieces? It's the midpoint of which point? Of AC. So I'm pretty sure this piece here and this piece here have to be the same. So I'm going to say AB, segment AB, is congruent to segment BC because of the definition of a midpoint. Do you see anything else that's the same in both triangles? I hope you do. What two letters are the same in both triangles? If you know them, say them out loud. DB is the same as segment DB. I'm using segment bars because they are sides. This is our third piece of information. It's the same, so I had 3 congruent marks because DB is going to be the same in both triangles. The reason why something is the same thing as itself is the reflexive property of congruence. Now I know why the two triangles are congruent. Now I know why triangle DAB is congruent to triangle DCB. I have a reason. I just look at my triangle and I can tell which one of the 5 shortcuts I could use. There's a side touching a side touching a side, a side touching a side touching a side. That's the same in both. I'm using side, side, side. And then the 5th step, the last step, I'm trying to prove that angle DAB is congruent to triangle, or I'm sorry, I said triangle, but I meant to say angle DAB is congruent to angle DCB. By the corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Cpctc. I'm going to end your notes right there.